Kia koutou ngā mātāwaka, ngā karangatanga iwi ke kone, ngā maunga whakahī kua hui mai nei, tēnā koutou. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā tātou katoa. Welcome to this post-election panel on a typically terrible Wellington day. I appreciate that you have all made the effort to come out. So joining us to talk through what the next government might bring over the next 3 years and what the coalition negotiations and other negotiations might look like are to my left. Of course, we've introduced Liam on the far left and then Jenée, and they're both going to introduce themselves, and then we're going to jump into the discussion. I'll pass to you, Jenée, first.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out on this typical Wellington day. My name is Jenée Tibschraeny. I'm the Herald's Wellington Business Editor. So I'm a journalist. I'm based at the Press Gallery across the road at Parliament. My job is perhaps a little bit different to some of the political journalists because I'm in the business team. So I sit in the business team, but I'm based at Parliament, which I think is a really interesting place to be. I can report on economic policy, Reserve Bank policy, that sort of thing, things that affect the economy from Parliament. Prior to joining the Herald, I've only been there for a year and a half. I was at interest.co.nz, which is sort of a slightly more specialist finance publication. And I've also done a bit of time at News Talk ZB and what's now known as News Hub Nation. So that's just a bit about me.
My name's Liam Hehir. I've been writing about politics for various publications since about 2013. I've written for most of them, for Stuff, for Newsroom, for the spin-off. I had a long stint with them, The Guardian, all the same ones that I think you've cycled through, Morgan. But at the moment, I don't have a regular writing spot. I have my own newsletter, but I do quite a bit of broadcast for radio and television, so Q&A, News Hub Nation every now and then, and News Talk ZB and RNZ 9 to noon, that sort of thing. So my perspective is that I am a National Party member, and it's always been my niche to write about the National Party and the National Party's perspective on things. So I'm very much an opinion journalist. Well, not even a journalist, I'm an opinion writer.
Sure, thanks, Liam. I should also say that everyone on stage is an alumnus of Victoria University of Wellington as well. I just had to get that shout out in there just to make sure that they pay my wages next week. So that is out of the way. Now, I wanted to start with you, Liam. David Seymour has released the white smoke from the conclave, indicating that a deal with the National Party might be imminent. I'm wondering what you think that deal might include.
It's definitely going to include like a sort of made-up role for being Minister of, regulatory reform or red tape cutting, that sort of gimmick that we've actually seen quite a bit of in the past, which probably won't amount to too much. But apart from that, it is a bit of a black box. So just before we came on, I called up some of my mates who are National Party MPs. Now, bear in mind, they're not at the top table. A lot of them, they're at the kids' table, and it's still quite uncertain because there's a missing element too, right? Which is that there's not too much that can be promised while the third party hasn't made a deal yet. And I think those negotiations are going very, very slowly at the moment. There was this kind of hope that it would be a tripartite negotiation or agreement, and that hasn't come to fruition at all. And so things are going very, very slow in terms of emails being exchanged and they have to be checked with the other side, just possibly the worst way to possibly negotiate it. So not a lot of news on portfolios yet because it's not known what portfolios can be allocated. But it was always going to be the case that this was a deal that was going to be, this side of it was going to be relatively quick to wrap up. I don't know what Seymour has been promised yet, but really it's quite meaningless until we know what Winston's going to agree to.
Do you think, we've seen noises from David Seymour that he is pushing for a referendum on the Treaty of Waitangi, but then on the other side, of course, you have Chris Luxon indicating that that would be, I think his words were unhelpful and divisive. Do you think that that is a negotiating tactic by Seymour, or is he genuinely seeking to have a referendum on the treaty? What do you think?
My own read on David Seymour has always been that as much as I don't agree with a lot of what David Seymour thinks and believes, he's actually not that much of a cynical politician. He believes in the stuff that he pushes to the extent that that's sometimes contradictory or contains internal contradictions. It's just because he's a human and humans have those contradictions. So I believe that it's an easy one for him to give up in the negotiation, and I do predict that nothing's going to happen on that front because obviously the juice won't be worth the squeeze of it, the social chaos that will follow. But I wouldn't see it as a cynical negotiating point for him to drop. I think he is quite sincere in his belief in that being a good thing to have, but it's just a very easy one for him to give up.
Jenée, as a member of the gallery or someone embedded in the gallery, what are your thoughts on the position of New Zealand First in these negotiations? Do you have a view, or is there a view emerging amongst yourself or amongst your colleagues about what policy gains Winston Peters might be pushing, or indeed the things which he may drop from his negotiations as well?
Well, from a journalist perspective, Winston Peters is going to make my life interesting and difficult. Might help us sell some newspapers. It was actually interesting that recently he went on the platform that Sean Plunkett's sort of more alternative media outlet to talk straight to the public that way, sort of sidestepping mainstream media, sidestepping general normal conventions of having press conferences and stand-ups. So I think he'll keep playing that up, keep playing up the mainstream media as the enemy. And we're not perfect at all. So much room for improvement, but I find that a bit dangerous, and that's going to make our lives difficult. In terms of the policy gains, I wonder whether they might push for an associate finance position, both Seymour and Peters. Also, foreign affairs, that's the one that Winston Peters has had before, and, conversations I've had is actually he did that job well. MFAT liked working with Winston Peters. He could, was professional, good to work with, so that could be something. Regional development is the other one that they might need to give to New Zealand First. Something, I don't think they're going to get a provincial growth fund again. $3 billion, I can't see that happening, but they'll have to get something. And the other one was the COVID inquiry. So there's already a COVID inquiry underway. I'm not sure if there's a way of sort of broadening the remit of that or doing something to satisfy the sort of disenfranchised vote that voted for New Zealand First. I think it's their number 3, Casey Costello, not Tracy. Winston kept calling her Tracy on the radio a couple of days ago. It was a bit awkward. And I think she was quite a key person in that movement. So they'll have to do something on that COVID front as well.
Can I just say, I think that tax is a genuine sticking point in these negotiations. And in particular, I think the bright line tax, it's going to be really interesting to see where that lands, because you have New Zealand First, quite strongly. So New Zealand First's manifesto this year actually had a lot of stuff that was very, you'd actually kind of think it was National Party stuff. It had a lot of Christopher Luxon's kind of Luxonisms in it. Things like, we need to be more like, Singapore and Ireland, that sort of stuff that you might think Christopher Luxon might say. But they're quite strong in the manifesto and on the trail about the bright line tax, right? So at the moment, the bright line tax is extended out to 10 years. ACT want it scrapped altogether, and the National Party want it back to 2. And what I can tell you is that amongst property people who are engaged in the real estate sector, as I am as a jobbing lawyer, the bright line tax is actually quite a big thing, right? And so the bright line tax is something that people have been will be very disappointed with if National doesn't at least get it back to 2 years. Not huge swaths of the population, but parts of the population that are important to National. So I'm really interested to see how that shakes out, whether or not the compromise is that it comes back from 10 to 5, or if they could do something more creative with it, like move it to a rebuttable presumption of taxation, something that's more boring and technical. But I think that kind of issue is going to be a sticking point, because New Zealand First remains quite populist on tax, and the National Party has made some big promises to its supporters about delivering tax cuts or tax relief.
I think a similar sticking point as well as the proposed foreign buyers tax. which National is proposing to help fund their tax cuts for middle income earners. What do you think Winston Peters or New Zealand First position on the foreign buyers tax might be? I mean, if we all say the word foreign loud enough, the shiver will go up Winston Peters' spine across the road. What do you think is going to happen to it? And I'll pose a question to you both.
I think it's another one of those examples that it's an easy one to give up in the negotiation, right? Because the revenue to be raised from it, let's be honest, it's not likely to be as much as was advertised. And the unpopularity of relaxing the foreign buyers ban is a liability that you just don't need. Personally, I think that the foreign buyers ban was a step in the wrong direction, but you got to pick your battles, right? If that's an easy concession for National to make to New Zealand First, I think they'll make it.
Yeah, and I mean, while New Zealand First is, opposed to foreign buyers, at least you are taxing them. So it makes it a bit more palatable. You say, come in foreign buyers, but we are actually taxing you. And they need to generate that revenue. So that's a really fundamental part of National's plan. The other fundamental part actually on the tax side, which has not received much attention, is depreciation deductibility. So that's if you're a commercial or industrial building owner. National was saying you can no longer deduct depreciation as an expense. It's not a vote winner, very sort of technical thing, but that's expected to generate an extra $500 million of revenue a year. Like, that is really, really significant. And actually Labor is campaigning or campaigned on making the same change. So when COVID came along, they changed those deductibility rules to give businesses a bit of a break, but it was seen to be permanent. Now, both National and Labor, easy revenue grab, make the commercial property owners pay a bit more tax, $500 million a year. That's quite a bit. It'll be interesting to see, though, how that bodes with New Zealand First, which is sort of pro, manufacturing and has talked about a lot about improving productivity and supporting businesses that way. So that might be another sticking point.
It's actually very annoying that it's such a political football, because it moves backwards and forwards in terms of the tax treatment of those assets. Like, it's just, it'd be good if we could have some consensus, and then that just stays the case for how we tax those expenses or depreciation. But yeah, I mean, I think that the country needs the revenue, right? I think that we're more likely to see that reform than not.
Yeah, and I mean, just in terms of the flipping around with the taxes, it is really disruptive, and we have seen that with even the Bright Line test. When National was in government, it introduced it at 2 years, then Labor pushed it out to 5 years, then to 10 years, but 5 years for new builds. Now National wants to bring it back to 2 years. I mean, it's an absolute, if you're just your average person and you're navigating this, it's really complex. And then you add the interest deductibility rule into it as well. It's if you're a landlord, you under Labor can't write off interest as an expense. It's just I think National and the new government is going to have to be cognizant of, yes, they might not agree with everything that the former government did, but what's worse? Is it actually worse to just confuse everyone, line the pockets of accountants, and make it really hard for your average person? And I think that's a question they're going to need to really think about.
It's not bad for property lawyers either.
Rightfully.
And so you don't buy and sell a residential property, and you've got 3 different forms to work out based on when the property was purchased or when the contract was signed, and and all that. What would be great, and I don't see it coming anytime soon, though, is for a accord between National and Labor as to settling down tax laws and bedding them in and saying, right, we all don't have what we want. We're all things we don't like, but this, for the sake of consistency, let's have some consensus.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would personally vote for a consensus on higher taxes and a broader tax base. But I do wonder, to switch the focus of the discussion onto the opposition now, where you think the tax debate will go over the next 3 years, because Chris Hipkins looks entrenched for the next year at least. But of course, he could not argue for a broader tax base and higher tax rates. So where do you think that contest or lack of consensus between the left and right is going over the next year to 3 years?
Well, firstly, I just want to say I think that this whole issue of tax is so fraught. And as a journalist, I often reflect on myself and the way I report tax issues, because I find it disappointing, actually, that so what the former government introduced in terms of the bright line test at 10 years and the interest deductibility, the government was too scared to put a capital gains tax in place. But the combination of the bright line test and interest deductibility is actually more heavy-handed on investors, and that captures a whole lot of, average mum and dad type investors with one other property. So the bright line test, the capital gain is taxed at your income tax rate, so it could be up to 39%. If there was a capital gains tax, you could have put it at 20%, much more simple, fewer loopholes. Interest deductibility is really actually hampering investors' cash flow. Now, that might be a good thing, but if we were so scared of upsetting the investors, I don't know why on earth we have this complex web of interest deductibility, bright line, exemptions. Is it the main home? Isn't it? Blah, blah, blah. Yeah. Nice, smooth capital gains tax could have been much easier. So what's my point? Sorry, that's a bit of a rant, just a personal view. Pro capital gains tax. But it would be nice if we could just have a sensible chat about it and not such a kind of, there wasn't much fanfare about interest deductibility because, no one understands it. The words interest deductibility don't sell newspapers, but capital gains tax does.
Yeah. I think, just on your point, I think last time Labor had the capital gains tax, I think the rate was 17%, wasn't it? 15 or 17%, something like that, which is more consistent with how they tax unearned income overseas. But to get away from the actual policy and towards the politics, it depends, right? Like, so do we know, did Chris Hipkins survive the confidence vote this morning? Do we have an answer yet? Have we got that puff of white smoke yet? Yeah. I don't know, because I think, to the extent that there was dissent within the now opposition Labour Party, it was over that issue, right? That idea that actually either Labor missed the opportunity to be bold when it was popular, or it's unpopular because it wasn't bold enough. But in any event, there was this sense of disgruntlement about not taking the opportunity to actually have a more radical, what I would call a radical tax reform. Really clear who the leader of that faction is. Really, we can say that that's David Parker, right? So whether or not he is himself going to be the challenger to Hipkins, or whether or not he's just going to be the godfather and there's someone else who is a young buck who's going to step into those shoes, that is actually, I think, a genuine inflection point for where we go in the next 3 years. It's really hard for Chris Hipkins to have held the line, to have made the captain's call, to have retained the status quo, to then sell himself as the agent of change in terms of taxation in this country. And so certainly I think in the short term, if Hipkins survives, it's going to be a much more targeted opposition that focuses on National's failures rather than presenting an alternative vision, because Chris Hipkins is just in that mould of the pragmatic kind of Trevor Mallard type politician who's really good at criticising, but isn't really the type to articulate and sell a vision. And that just comes down to differences of style.
And also, I think I'm unconvinced that if Labor did come out with that wealth tax proposal that Parker was keen for, I'm unconvinced that would have improved their result, because at the moment, property owners are, I know it's easy to beat up on property owners, but they're taking it quite tough, especially, young people with mortgage rates as high as they are. We already have these property taxes. Even if you think it might be the right idea, I don't think if they came out with some wealth tax package, they would have secured a better election result. I think that the election result hinged on greater things, like in terms of delivery, in terms of people being sick of COVID, Aucklanders being upset by the lockdowns, all these other issues. I don't think it was a wealth tax thing. Yeah,
and I know this is a point of contention, but Morgan will probably correct me here, but we did have two parties that were promising a wealth tax, and they got between them about 15 or 16%, whereas all the other parties that made up the vast majority of the vote were against it or campaigned against having one. Now, actually, politics isn't that simple, and if the Labor Party was in favour of a wealth tax, maybe that would have had more favourability. But I have to really endorse what Jenée said, which is that this was an election based on forces and trends and how people were feeling, not on their opinions on abstract possibilities, but what their real life was like now.
Outside of my authority, Matthew Houghton, who argued that he thought Chiffy's decision, Captain's Call to rule out a wealth tax, was what led to or precipitated Labour's decline. Obviously, the Greens went up, and I think the very next poll that was taken. But as you say, it's interesting to note that the Greens went up at Labour's expense, but Labour did not take votes at National's expense or the other party's expense as well. So I do want to pick up on those broader forces, but I think this is something that most people would agree on, because you all know it very well in your daily lives. Inflation and the cost of living and the bite that's taken out of people's budgets, or indeed making people's lives more difficult. So I wonder what you think, though, about the National Party and even New Zealand First's approach to this. And Jenée, I wanted to ask about their approach to the Reserve Bank. National is making noises about reforming their mandate, and New Zealand First is making noises about reforming their mandate as well, but maybe in a bit of a contradictory manner to the National Party. Where do you think the reform of the Reserve Bank might land after these negotiations?
Yeah, so currently, the Reserve Bank is tasked with its Monetary Policy Committee has to target inflation, keep that between 1% and 3%, and have maximum sustainable employment, right? So there's no number put on that, but those are the two targets, and they have equal weighting. National has said, let's get rid of the employment target, which is, relatively new, but also a lot of other central banks around the world have that. They say, get rid of that target, just make them focus on inflation. That's the way to bring inflation down. What National won't say is, are they implying the Reserve Bank should be hiking interest rates more aggressively to get on top of inflation? There's still a question mark around that. Seymour Act is also keen to get rid of employment, make them just focus on inflation, and then actually Winston Peters a few years ago was keen to broaden what the Reserve Bank targets to look at not just inflation but GDP and a bunch of other measures, because he thought it was myopic to just use interest rates to target inflation. So interestingly, I don't think New Zealand First has really talked much about the Reserve Bank and its targets ahead of this election. So I think that they will be able to ditch the employment target, just make the Reserve Bank focus on inflation as per what ACT and National are campaigning on. Will that make a difference to inflation? No, I don't think it will, because the Reserve Bank has hiked interest rates aggressively. It takes time for those interest rate effects, interest rate hikes to take effect. You only really feel it when you go to refix your mortgage, or when you finally cotton on to the fact that you're not earning much interest in your savings account and you should pop your money in a term deposit because the rates are quite good. I think the jury's still out. I don't know if it'll make a big difference in the current environment. Perhaps in other parts of the economic cycle, it might make a difference. Some people say, like Arthur Grimes, who invented inflation targeting from New Zealand, he is very pro just inflation target. And he reckons if they only had an inflation target, they wouldn't have cut interest rates by as much, done all the money printing, all of that when COVID came along to boost employment. So anyway, I think that's where that's at.
I mean, I agree with you that it's a bit of a fake controversy in some ways. I mean, you probably know, you do know more about this than I do, but you've got this like Phillips curve idea where inflation and employment are enemies, and that you increase unemployment and that gets inflation down, and vice versa, and it's sort of been busted for a long time. That over the longer term you can have low inflation and high employment. They don't need to be at odds with each other. And you think, okay, if the mandate was different, would the Reserve Bank have acted differently? Probably not. But when you're in opposition and inflation is high, you need someone to beat up on, and the Reserve Bank's an easy one, particularly because it can't really fight back, because it's not part of the political arm of government. It's meant to be independent. So it's easy to beat up on the Reserve Bank, and the Reserve Bank does a lot of things that probably deserve calling for a lot of criticism, but fundamentally I don't really see a lot of change.
And that's been something that's been interesting to watch as well, as Nicola Willis as National's finance spokesperson. She has, attacked Adrian Orr, the governor of the Reserve Bank, quite a bit during select committees. She's been really sort of aggressive and she's gotten right in there. I think she's been really effective in her role, as an opposition spokesperson. And Adrian Orr, being the sort of personality he is, has sometimes bit back, and there's been a bit of drama in select committee, which has been entertaining. But and so some people have said, well, what's going to happen? Well, would National and ACT try to get rid of Adrian Orr? I doubt that would happen. You can't just get rid of someone like the governor of the Reserve Bank unless, according to the law, he's not fulfilled his duties and done all these things, which is you can't. I don't think you can really argue that. So I think that everyone will just get on with it. They'll be professionals. There'll be a bit of, like a little bit of head bashing, but I think Adrian Orr's not going anywhere, in my humble opinion.
And there was head bashing between Adrian Orr and the current government from time to time too, right? So it's just a new interesting development in government Reserve Bank relations.
Yeah, and it was interesting. Last Friday, Adrian Orr did a speech on climate change, and National and ACT keep having a go at the Reserve Bank for focusing on climate change, because they say, well, the Reserve Bank should just focus on inflation. And then the Reserve Bank says, well, actually, climate change is kind of a big deal, and it does affect inflation, and it affects financial stability. Like if there's a big flood and all of our houses get damaged, then what happens to the bank that actually technically owns the houses? So they argue that, but I just think the fact that Adrian Orr did the speech on climate change on Friday, just as the new government came in, even though it's exactly what the new government is saying, stop doing that, he's like, well, I'm doing it anyway. And I might be reading into it too much, but he also mentioned the employment before he mentioned inflation when he talked about the targets. So I think, to me, that's potentially a sign of the Reserve Bank saying, no, we're doing our thing, and we're not going to be, we're not going to buckle over for the new government's ideological views.
Because this is a Wellington audience, and I do recognise many faces here from the public service, I do want to ask a question about whether the incoming government is going to encounter maybe the words are recalcitrant public service. We saw in the last term of government, former ministers like Stuart Nash, quoting the Roosevelt quote about the man in the arena as if he was some great insurgent battling against the public service and the people trying to thwart his agenda. Now, do you think that was a proper representation of what is happening in Wellington, or do you think that it's overblown? The current government will get its agenda through the public service very easily. Commissioned advice will be very easy. Do you think that there are roadblocks sitting there?
Well, why don't you go first? You live in Wellington.
I don't know.
Okay. I'll be brave, and I'll confront the audience of public servants with my National Party views. No, look, we don't have that kind of, public sector reform is an important thing for the National Party. It's also, I think, an important challenge for the country on the whole. And it's not about making the public sector weak or, it's actually one of the problems we have is that the public sector, and you talk to public servants and they will often agree with this, is that it can't get the job done. It itself has too many roadblocks in doing the job that the public sector wants to do, right? And so it's not necessarily about shrinking it to the point where you can, drown it in the bathtub. It's about actually empowering that you need to have a strong public sector, right? Now, we also don't have a corrupt public sector, right? So, we're really blessed in that country that we have a professional public sector that is actually, transparent and, holds the ethos of public sector neutrality, as much as those of us on the right might like to joke about it. The biggest problem is simply the problem that you always have when you try to reform any organisation, which is that it's really hard to do, to battle inertia. There are things that you don't understand are going to be problems. You eliminate a job and you don't understand that actually that person was doing something really important. And even though the overall numbers have to come down a little bit or have to become a bit leaner, you're going to have a whole lot of problems along the way. So I think that public sector reform is important, and it is going to be difficult, and there are going to be a lot of failures and troubles, but it's not because of any any serious intransigence or refusal to comply on the part of the public sector. Our public sector is far too professional for that. It's just that it's really, really hard to reform a built existing organic organisation or sort of system, and I think Labor found that too, right? Oftentimes, the Labor ministers often butt their heads about the inability to reform things and get things changing, but that's not because the public sector were corrupt or resisting in any sort of overt or coordinated way. It's just that it's actually really, really hard to change an organisation. You know, universities go through it, workplaces go through it. Public sector is no different.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, the former government wanted to reform a range of things. So if you're proposing major reforms or whole new policies like the income insurance, that was Grant Robertson's pet project. If you're doing a lot of change, you know, that creates jobs, and then if you get rid of it, those jobs go. Where do those people go? It kind of gets a bit messy. But for the incoming government, it wants to get rid of a whole lot of things, repeal things. You know, Three Waters, we don't want this, we don't want that. But then there's still a problem. Like, how do you fix those issues? Those issues are still there, and somebody still needs to be employed to fix those problems.
Yeah. Not only that, but the other thing, which I always complain about to my friends in the National Party, is that, like, a big thing, if you talk about the effectiveness of the public sector, a big thing that limits the ability of the public sector to be effective is the quality of legislation, right? Which is actually passed by the political part of the government, not by the public sector. So in my day-to-day job as a lawyer, you know, like, I struggle with legislation like the anti-money laundering laws sometimes, you know, and that has to be implemented and enforced and overseen by the Department of Internal Affairs. And so they've got a whole lot of people that they have to employ to figure things out and all that. But that comes down to vague legislation that's passed, half measures like, you know, the bright line tests, things like that, you know, things that aren't really done in a comprehensive and clean way. That falls on bureaucrats to try to implement. And if it's, the more vague it is, the more bureaucrats you need. So, you know, a lot of it falls on the National Party or any government to actually clean up their act too.
In a couple of minutes, I'll invite questions from the audience in Zoom. But just before that, I want you to answer this really quickly if you can. Can Chris Luxon handle Winston Peters and David Seymour?
I think he might prefer to be the New Zealand envoy to the Middle East. Guys, might be less of a challenge, you know, work his way up to it. Look, listen, I was quite optimistic at first, and I've become less optimistic over time. I think the failure there, the fact that they weren't able to get into like a good tripartite three-way negotiation, and we're sort of, by all reports, back to exchanging emails and things like that, is quite a bad sign. Look, in some ways, I sort of think, okay, if he's got Winston and Seymour to play off against each other, then, you know, that actually gives them a bit of an organisational advantage. But the fact is that they're going to need both to pass any legislation is actually probably going to make, you know, reduce any of that advantage back to nothing. You know, talking to, you know, despite what you might think, I'm friends with a few current and former Labor Party cabinet ministers, talking to them in private about what it's like to have Winston around the cabinet table. The idea is, look, you just have to be really different to him. You've got to show him the due respect. And the problem is that I don't think David Seymour is kind of really like that. You know, like, he himself is very outspoken. He considers himself to be very principled. I think he will struggle in that environment too. So that's why I think the happiest that Chris Luxon's ever going to be was election night. But on the other hand, and this is where I think the fact that he's not, like, you know, people talk about Chris Luxon like he's a businessman, you know, but it's not like Chris Luxon invented Air New Zealand in his garage, you know, having maxed out his credit cards, you know, like, it's a majority government owned corporation. It's huge, right? You've got to manage stakeholders. You don't have the control. It's not your empire that you have the control over. So this is one of those things where I think that actually being a CEO of an existing company where you've come in and you've had to manage those personalities and know that you don't have the full sovereignty or control might give him a bit of an edge that other contenders for Prime Minister from the National Party actually don't have.
Yeah, but on that, as a, if you are a CEO, which I don't have experience in, then I just don't think you get people challenging you that much because you are the boss. Your engagements with, well, the media at least are very staged. You have your sit down interview for 10 minutes and it's not, if you interview a CEO in terms of like company results or something, it's a CEO and they've got the army of comms people there. They're all briefed. They have their talking points and they have their polite business journalists asking questions for 10 minutes. And off they go. You don't have, the media yelling at you. You're on stage and you've got journos yelling questions at you, or Winston Peters being potentially rude to you. I don't know how that'll go. So I think it might be challenging for him.
I think Luxon and Peters will be fine together. I think it's the Peters Seymour dynamic I'm more worried about. You make a really good point though, and with Luxon, not only being a CEO type, but also being so new to politics to begin with. I remember he's 3.5 years in. You can really tell he's got that sort of manner about him, which a lot of National Party sort of MPs have when they first come in, which is they're really good in that sort of, I guess you could call it like a captive audience, sort of like a chamber of commerce business breakfast where, there's true difference, there aren't going to be a whole lot of follow-up questions and the follow-up questions that you do get, you can sort of bat away. Whereas, you know what the animals are like over there, like they're never going to let go of anything. And all of a sudden you find yourself, sort of flustered or without answers. And I think that we did see that Luxon struggled with that a little bit in the campaign, that change from being, the king to actually having to be the servant in some ways.
Yeah, I think he has improved a lot. So initially, Christopher Luxon made quite a few gaffes. He'd say the wrong thing, and we wouldn't understand the policy properly, and then Nicola Willis would have to swoop up behind him and mop it all up. But recently, I think he's been better. But the challenge for him will still be in those. In a situation with media where he can't get away and divert the question. I don't know if anyone saw that Jack Tame interview.
Yeah,
I thought that was. I think Jack Tame's done a great job actually in the campaign. Has had some really hard hitting interviews, but that was challenging for Chris Luxon. He couldn't say, "Oh, next question from someone else, please."
And for what it's worth, an insight that I have heard is that Luxon can be very direct and blunt when he needs to be, and that for example, in the National Party list ranking, when he basically got his way, and it didn't quite work out because of the electorates, but he got his way in having a much more gender balanced list anyway, and that was really him stamping his mark on it, and coming into the list ranking committee, which is meant to be democratic, but saying right, no, it's going to be this way, and I think if he can do that with Seymour, and he can bring Seymour into line a little bit and manage that relationship, I think the Peters-Luxon thing, I think Luxon's got Peters kind of figured out. And in the last couple of weeks after the election, you've seen that he hasn't made any moves to startle Winston. He's, been sort of, careful and cautious and hasn't been too presumptuous. So I think that's going to be the key. If it's going to work on the basis of the Seymour element, I think everything else will fall into place.
Yeah. I think all the best politicians have a switch. I would like to thank you on behalf of Victoria University of Wellington and our external events team for coming out here on this relatively rainy day. We've appreciated your company. Now we do have to clear the room relatively quickly, so I'll farewell you and hope you all have a great day. Ka kite.